The plasma bolt missed Councilor Vane Soria's skull by 3 centimeters. It struck the marble lectern behind her instead, carving a black trench through the polished stone and spraying fragments across the amphitheater floor. She felt the heat of it sear the cartilage ridge above her left ear, and for one frozen heartbeat, the entire conclave assembly went silent. 400 alien delegates in tiered seating, holographic displays flickering with the agenda of the day. The glass dome overhead showing a cloudless sky where, very far away, the silhouettes of patrol cruisers drifted in formation. Then the screaming began. Security drones converged from 6 angles. The shooter, a minor functionary from the Dralith delegation, his face a mask of righteous fury, was pinned to the gallery railing before his weapon could cycle for a second shot. Vane Soria stood motionless on the speaker's platform, one hand still resting on the ruined lectern, and watched her own pale blue blood drip from the graze wound down the side of her neck. She did not flinch. She did not duck. She simply turned her elongated head toward the Dralith section and let the silence settle. "Note for the transcript," she said, her voice carrying across the amphitheater with the flat calm of someone reading a weather report. I had not yet begun my remarks. If the Dralith delegation wished to file a formal objection, there is a procedural mechanism for that. Nervous laughter from a handful of seats. Most of the chamber was too stunned to respond. Chancellor Torvan, the presiding officer of the conclave, recovered first. He was Valori, like Vane's same blue-gray skin, same elongated cranial structure, but where she was lean and angular, he was broad, heavy-jowled, draped in ceremonial robes that cost more than some colony budgets. He slammed the resonance gavel 3 times. "Order, order in this chamber. Councilor Soria, are you injured?" "Superficially." "Do you require medical?" "I require the floor, Chancellor, which I was granted 14 minutes ago." And that was the moment everything began to unravel. The medical drone that hovered toward the platform was intercepted by Vane's raised palm. She did not want treatment. She did not want the wound sealed, the blood cleaned, the graze hidden beneath a dermal patch. She wanted every delegate in this chamber to see the streak of pale blue running down her neck for as long as she intended to stand here. She wanted them to see what their system had produced. In the gallery above, the Dralith delegation's senior attaches were engaged in frantic whispered conversation. 2 of them kept glancing at the spot where the shooter had been, the gallery railing now scorched with plasma residue, the security drones maintaining a perimeter around the empty space. A 3rd attaché was speaking rapidly into a personal communicator, shielding the device with his body, as if that would prevent the chamber's surveillance arrays from recording every word. It would not, and Vane knew exactly who he was calling. To understand what Vane Soria was about to do, and what it would cost her, you need to understand what the Conclave Assembly was voting on that day. The agenda item was designated Resolution 1187 Omega, on the permanent exclusion and territorial nullification of the human species from conclave-governed space. In plain language, it was an exile order, not a temporary sanction, not a trade restriction. A permanent, irrevocable expulsion of humanity from every star system, trade corridor, communication relay, and diplomatic venue under conclave jurisdiction. 42% of known space, gone. The resolution had been drafted by the Dralith, co-sponsored by the Cathari hegemony and the Torvan loyal bloc of Valori delegates. It had been fast-tracked through committee in 11 days, a process that normally took months. The public justification was the Meridian Corridor incident, in which a human naval squadron had fired on a Dralith patrol that had been blockading humanitarian aid shipments to a famine-stricken colony. 14 Dralith crew killed. The human captain's transmission had been 3 words: move or burn. The real reason, which everyone in the chamber understood and no one said aloud, was simpler. Humanity was growing too fast, too capable, too unwilling to defer, and the old powers wanted them gone before the balance tipped. The vote was scheduled for that afternoon. The math was brutal. 312 delegates had publicly committed to voting yes. 61 were committed no. 27 were abstaining. That left the resolution passing by a margin so wide that no procedural challenge could touch it. The human delegation had been given one seat in the gallery, observer status only, no speaking rights, no vote. Ambassador Kira Vasquez sat in that seat now, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She was 43 years old, dark-skinned, dark-haired, wearing a fitted charcoal blazer with silver diplomatic insignia on the collar. She had been Earth's voice in this chamber for 6 years, and in 11 hours she would be expelled from it permanently. She had said nothing all morning. The Conclave had learned over those 6 years that Kira Vasquez's silence was never empty, but today most of them assumed it was simply defeat. They were wrong. Vane Soria had been a loyal Conclave councilor for 29 years. She had served on the Trade Regulation Committee, the Boundary Disputes Tribunal, and the Cultural Exchange Oversight Board. She had voted with the Valori bloc on every major resolution since her appointment. She had never once dissented publicly from Chancellor Torvan's position. She was, by every measurable standard, a model institutionalist, the kind of delegate who believed that the system, however flawed, was the only alternative to chaos. What no one in the chamber knew, what even Kira Vasquez did not know until 3 days ago, was that Vane Soria had been quietly documenting Conclave corruption for the past 4 years. It had started small, a trade subsidy that went to a Cathari mining consortium instead of the colony it was earmarked for, a boundary dispute ruling that conveniently expanded Dralith territorial claims, a medical research grant diverted to weapons development, each incident individually explainable. Collectively, they formed a pattern so clear it made her stomach turn. The Conclave was not a governing body. It was a cartel dressed in parliamentary procedure. She had compiled her findings into a document she called the Ledger. 417 pages of transactions, communications intercepts, vote trading records, and financial transfers. She had hidden copies in 3 separate locations outside Conclave jurisdiction, and she had waited for the right moment to use it. The waiting had been the hardest part, not the research that was mechanical, methodical, almost soothing in its clarity. You followed the money. You cross-referenced the dates. You noted which delegates voted which way on which days, and then you looked at their financial records for the preceding weeks, and the pattern emerged like a bruise developing under the skin. Slow, undeniable. No, the hard part was sitting in that chamber day after day, session after session, voting alongside colleagues she now knew were purchased, smiling at Chancellor Torvan during receptions while carrying the knowledge that his ceremonial robes were financed by the species whose territorial claims he was supposed to adjudicate impartially, drafting committee reports that she knew would be overridden by back-channel deals before the ink dried. 4 years of that. 4 years of watching the machinery grind, knowing exactly which gears were broken and where the rust went deepest. 4 years of waiting for the moment when the cost of silence finally exceeded the cost of speaking. Resolution 1187 Omega was that moment. Not because the humans needed saving. Vane was not naive enough to think humanity couldn't survive exile. They were resourceful, aggressive, and had been building independent infrastructure for years. They would manage. No, the reason was simpler and harder. The resolution was wrong. It was the Conclave using its institutional machinery to punish a species for the crime of refusing to be subordinate. And if Vane voted for it, if she sat in her seat and raised her hand with the other 312, then every principle she had ever claimed to hold was a lie. So she had contacted Kira Vasquez. A single encrypted message, 3 days before the vote. I need the floor for as long as possible. Can your people give me a reason to keep talking? Vasquez's reply had been 4 words. How long do you need? As long as it takes. Then we'll give you everything. What arrived on Vane's private terminal 12 hours later was a data archive that made the ledger look like a pamphlet. Human intelligence had been watching the Conclave for far longer than anyone suspected. They had signals intercepts, financial forensics, communications metadata, and most damagingly recordings from inside Conclave committee rooms that were supposed to be shielded from external surveillance. Vane had spent 2 sleepless nights integrating the human intelligence with her own research. Where her ledger had gaps, suspicions she could not prove, connections she could trace but not document, the human data filled them. Where the human data lacked context, names they could not match, codes they could not break, her 4 years of institutional knowledge provided the key. Together, they had built something that was not merely evidence. It was a complete map of corruption, every pathway, every node, every payment, every lie. A map so detailed and so thoroughly verified that no institutional investigation could ignore it, no political maneuver could discredit it, and no power broker in the chamber could survive its publication. Vane had looked at the completed document on the night before the vote and felt something she had not expected. Calm. The decision was made. The cost was accepted. All that remained was the execution. She had slept for 4 hours. She had dressed in her formal council robes, the plain charcoal ones, not the ceremonial set. She had eaten a small meal. She had walked to the chamber. And someone had tried to kill her before she could open her mouth. Which, in retrospect, confirmed everything she was about to say. Chancellor Torvan was staring at her now with barely concealed irritation. The assassination attempt had disrupted his carefully orchestrated timeline. The vote was supposed to happen at the 14th hour. It was now the 11th. He needed 3 hours of procedural theater speeches, amendments, final committee reports, and then the hammer would fall. What he did not need was Vane Soria on the speaker's platform with blood on her neck and a formal speaking allocation. Councilor Soria, he said, given the security incident, I am prepared to offer a brief recess so that. I decline the recess, Chancellor. I have remarks to deliver. Your allocated speaking time is 15 minutes. My allocated speaking time, Vane said, is governed by Conclave Procedural Code Section 44, subsection 12, which grants any delegate who has survived a violent incident on the chamber floor an extended allocation for the purpose of addressing the security implications thereof. The allocation is not capped. Silence. Torvan's jaw tightened. She could see his aides whispering furiously behind the dais, pulling up the procedural code on their displays. Section 44, subsection 12 was real. It was an obscure provision written 3 centuries ago after a series of political assassinations. No one had invoked it in living memory. But it was on the books, and it had no time limit. You are invoking Section 44, Torvan said slowly. I am. For the purpose of addressing security implications. For the purpose of addressing the security, institutional, and procedural implications of an assassination attempt carried out on the chamber floor by a member of a sponsoring delegation of Resolution 1187 Omega, which I believe is relevant to the integrity of the vote scheduled for this afternoon. Torvan looked like he had swallowed something sharp, but the procedural code was clear, and 400 delegates were watching, and the chamber's recording systems were broadcasting to 11 billion viewers across conclave space. The floor is yours, Councilor. Vane Soria straightened. She looked out across the amphitheater, the tiered seats rising in concentric curves, the holographic displays pulsing with data, the glass dome above letting daylight pour down onto her shoulders. She could feel the warmth of it on her face. She could feel the blood drying on her neck. She began. What followed would later be called the longest uninterrupted address in conclave history. Historians would debate whether it was a speech, a prosecution, or an act of political demolition. Legal scholars would write dissertations on the procedural mechanism she exploited and the constitutional implications of its use. Political analysts would study it as a case study in institutional disruption, how one delegate, armed with evidence and a procedural loophole, dismantled a power structure that had controlled galactic governance for 3 decades. But in the moment, it was none of those things. It was just a woman with a bleeding neck, standing in front of 400 people who wanted her to stop and refusing to stop. "The delegate who just tried to kill me," Vane said, "is a man named Praul Vesk, junior attaché to the Dralith Trade Mission. He has served in this building for 3 years. His personnel file lists him as a trade analyst. His actual function, according to documents I have obtained, is political enforcement." She paused, let the words settle. Praul Vesk's salary is paid by the Dralith Diplomatic Corps, but his operational funding, the account that pays for his housing, his travel, his encrypted communications equipment, comes from a different source. A private account held by the Cathari Hegemony's External Affairs Bureau. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. In the Cathari section, a dozen delegates exchanged sharp glances. "I have the transaction records," Vane continued. 14 monthly transfers, each routed through a clearinghouse on Velen Station. "I have the clearinghouse's confirmation codes. I have Praul Vesk's personal communication logs, which include instructions, not requests, instructions from a Cathari handler designated only as oversight. The most recent instruction, received 41 hours ago, reads as follows." She touched the display panel on her lectern. A holographic projection bloomed above the amphitheater floor, visible to every seat in the chamber. Text in Cathari script, with Conclave standard translation running beneath it. Oversight to VESK. The VALORI delegate SORAYA is preparing a procedural challenge. Neutralize before floor allocation. Confirm when complete. The chamber erupted. Torvund slammed the gavel. "Order, Councilor Soria, the authenticity of these documents is verifiable. I have submitted certified copies to the Independent Verification Office as of 6 hours ago. Their preliminary authentication is included in the packet currently being distributed to every delegate's secure terminal." Torvund's display chimed. So did 400 others. Vane watched the Chancellor's face as he read the verification header, and she saw the exact moment he realized she was not bluffing. But he was a politician. He adapted. "These are serious allegations," he said carefully. "I will instruct the Security Committee to convene an investigation following today's proceedings. In the meantime, Councilor, I must ask whether your remarks are still relevant to—" "I'm not finished, Chancellor. Section 40.12 pertains to security implications. You have identified the security breach and its source. The procedural purpose of your allocation." "The procedural purpose of my allocation," Vane said, "is to address all implications. Security, institutional, procedural. I have addressed the security dimension. I have not yet begun the institutional dimension." Torvund's eyes narrowed. He understood now. She was stalling. "The institutional dimension," he repeated. The assassination attempt was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a systemic pattern of coercion, vote manipulation, and financial corruption that has compromised the integrity of this body for at least 4 years. I intend to present the evidence for that pattern in full. Councilor, I cannot allow the floor to be used for. Section 40.12 does not grant you discretion to limit the scope of remarks made under its protection, Chancellor. I checked. Twice. Another ripple of whispers through the chamber. Legal aides on 3 different delegations were pulling up the code, reading it again. Their faces confirmed what Vane already knew. The provision was bulletproof, written by a paranoid generation that had wanted to ensure no assassination could be swept under procedural convenience. Torvald sat back in his chair. He was trapped, and everyone in the chamber could see it. Vane Soria spoke for the next 2 hours and 40 minutes. She started with the Cathari financial transfers, the ones linked to Pralvesk, and expanded outward. She named accounts. She named intermediaries. She named the Conclave officials who had signed off on redirected funds, falsified inspection reports, and buried complaints from smaller delegations. The first name she dropped was Councilor Brethvani, head of the Trade Regulation Committee. She displayed his private banking records alongside the committee's funding allocation decisions for the past 3 years. The correlation was exact. Every quarter in which Vani had received a deposit from a Cathari-linked account, his committee had approved a Cathari trade corridor expansion. Every quarter without a deposit, the applications had been tabled for further review. Vani, who was sitting in the 7th tier, stood up. His mottled gray skin had gone almost white. "This is I object to the councillor has no authority to." "Sit down, Councilor Vani," Vane said, not shouting, not angry, just flat, the way you tell a child that recess is over. "Your objection is noted. Your banking records speak for themselves." He sat down. Every 12 to 15 minutes, she introduced a new document. Each one appeared as a holographic projection above the chamber floor, accompanied by verification codes from the Independent Verification Office. Each one landed like a detonation in a different section of the amphitheater. She showed the Uleksi Colonial Resettlement Fund, 78 million credits earmarked for refugee housing that had been diverted to a Dralith shipyard expansion. She showed the audit trail, the fund manager's signature, the counter-signature from the Conclave Treasury Office, the shell company that received the transfer, and the Dralith shipyard purchase order dated 6 days later for the exact amount. "The Uleksi refugees," Vane said, "spent that winter in emergency shelters designed for 3-month habitation. They are still in those shelters. The Dralith shipyard has produced 14 patrol vessels since the transfer." In the Uleksi section, a delegate was gripping the armrest of her seat so hard that the brushed steel was bending under her fingers. Her species was small, quiet, rarely heard from in the chamber, the kind of delegation that voted the way it was told and thanked the larger blocks for the privilege. The expression on her face now was not gratitude. The Dralith delegation tried to leave during the first hour. Vane invoked Procedural Code Section 17, which required all sponsoring delegations of an active resolution to maintain quorum presence until the resolution was voted on or withdrawn. They sat back down, their faces rigid with fury. The Cathari hegemon's personal representative requested a point of order to challenge Vane's speaking allocation. Torvan, who was by now visibly sweating beneath his ceremonial robes, ruled that points of order could not interrupt a Section 40 Fortwelve address. He looked like he wanted to rule otherwise, but the broadcast feeds were running, and the legal text was unambiguous. 20 minutes later, a second attempt was made to dislodge her. Delegate Parn of the Dralith Commerce Board rose and moved that Vane Soria be censured for conduct unbecoming a member of this body, and her speaking rights revoked. The motion required a 2/3 majority. It failed. Not by much, it received 54% of the vote, but it failed. And the fact that 46% of the chamber had voted against censuring a woman who was exposing documented corruption told Vane something important. The smaller delegations were listening. They were reading the documents on their terminals, and they were starting to calculate. Vane filed that observation away and kept talking. In the gallery, Kira Vasquez sat motionless. Her arms were still crossed. Her expression had not changed. But if anyone had been watching her hands, they would have noticed that her left thumb was tapping a slow, steady rhythm against her right forearm. She was counting. At the 90-minute mark, Vane reached the core of the ledger. Resolution 1187 Omega, she said, was drafted by the Drelith External Policy Bureau. The stated purpose is the permanent exclusion of humanity. The actual purpose, documented in internal Drelith planning communications I will now present, is the elimination of the only species in Conclave space whose independent trade capacity threatens the Drelith Cathari resource monopoly. She displayed the communications. They were devastating. Internal memos between Drelith trade officials and Cathari resource executives discussing the human problem in explicitly economic terms. Projections showing that within 15 years, human independent trade routes would reduce Drelith Cathari market share by 31%. Cost-benefit analyses of various containment strategies, with permanent exile ranked as the most cost-effective option. The Meridian Corridor incident, Vane said, which this resolution cites as its justification, was engineered. The Drelith patrol that blockaded humanitarian aid shipments to the Velen famine zone was operating under orders from the same External Policy Bureau that drafted this resolution. The blockade was designed to provoke a human military response. When that response came, 14 Drelith crew killed, which I do not minimize. It provided the pretext this resolution required. The chamber was no longer murmuring. It was roaring. Delegates were on their feet. The Drelith section was a wall of shouted denials. The smaller delegations, the ones who had been pressured into voting yes, were looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to dawning, furious comprehension. Torvald hammered the gavel until his arm shook. Order! I will have order in this chamber. Vane waited. She was patient. She had learned patience from watching Kira Vasquez sit in that gallery seat for 6 years, saying nothing, absorbing every insult, every procedural exclusion, every casual cruelty that the Conclave directed at the species it had decided was too dangerous to tolerate. Vasquez's patience was not passivity. It was storage. Every slight catalogued, every injustice remembered, every silence a promise that the reckoning would come when it was ready. Vane had learned that, and now she was spending it. She presented the weapons procurement scandal next a series of defense contracts awarded to Cathari weapons manufacturers without competitive bidding. The contracts had been approved by a Conclave security subcommittee chaired by a delegate whose campaign fund was managed by a Cathari financial services firm. The weapons were sold to planetary defense forces across Conclave space at a 40% markup above market rate. The markup went into a discretionary fund, controlled by Vane, displayed the account records Chancellor Torvald's office. The markup generated approximately 300 million credits over 4 years, Vane said. Those funds were used for what the Chancellor's office classified as diplomatic development initiatives. In practice, this meant payments to delegates whose votes were needed on key resolutions. I have the disbursement records. I have the recipients' names. I have their voting records before and after the payments. She displayed a table, 2 columns. One showed dates of payments from Torvald's discretionary fund to individual delegates. The other showed dates on which those delegates changed their publicly registered positions on pending resolutions. The correlation was not subtle. In the gallery, 3 delegates from the Morvan Federation simultaneously stood, walked to the aisle, and approached the vote registration terminal. They changed their votes in silence and returned to their seats. Nobody commented on it. There was nothing left to say. At the 2-hour mark, something changed. Delegate Thren Makari of the Selthan Compact, a minor power bloc that had been publicly committed to voting yes on resolution 1187 Omega, stood up and requested to change her vote registration. In light of the evidence presented, she said, her voice tight and careful, the Selthan Compact cannot in good conscience support a resolution whose foundational justification has been materially compromised. Torvald stared at her, Delegate Macari, the vote has not yet been called. I am aware. I am pre-registering a change for the record. 11 minutes later, another delegation switched, then 2 more. Then a block of 7. The math was moving. And in the chamber, you could feel it, that subtle atmospheric shift when a group of intelligent beings collectively realize that the ground rules have changed. Delegates who had spent the first hour glaring at Vane with hostility were now reading documents on their terminals with the focused intensity of people discovering that they, too, had been deceived. The corruption she was exposing was not just about humans. It was about every small species that had ever brought a complaint to the Conclave and been told the system was working as intended. It was about every trade deal that had gone sideways, every border ruling that had favored the powerful, every committee assignment that had been traded like currency. The Draelith and Cathari had not just been manipulating the human question. They had been running the entire institution as a profit center, and every species in the chamber was now recalculating how many of their own defeats had been purchased rather than decided. Vane kept talking. She had moved past the financial corruption now and into the procedural violations, the way the resolution had been fast-tracked, the committee hearings that had been shortened, the expert testimony that had been excluded. She laid out each violation with the precision of a surgeon, citing code sections, precedent rulings, dates, and names. She showed that the committee hearing on Resolution 1187 Omega had been scheduled for a day when 14 delegations known to oppose the resolution were off station for a religious observance. She showed that the expert testimony submitted by the Morvan Federation, a 60-page analysis arguing that human exile would destabilize 7 trade corridors, had been classified as supplementary material and excluded from the committee's deliberation record. She showed that the committee's own procedural officer had filed an internal objection to the fast-track timeline and been reassigned to a different committee 3 days later. She was not angry. That was the thing that unsettled the chamber most. There was no outrage in her voice, no trembling righteousness, no dramatic crescendos. She spoke the way a structural engineer describes a building's load-bearing failures clinically, thoroughly, with the implicit understanding that the collapse is already in progress, and the only question is how many floors come down. Torvund tried again at the 2-hour-20 mark. Councilor Soria, you have spoken for over 2 hours. I commend your thoroughness. However, I must ask whether you are approaching the conclusion of your remarks so that this body can proceed with its scheduled business. I am not approaching the conclusion, Chancellor. I have completed approximately 60% of the evidence I intend to present. 60%. The remaining 40% addresses the institutional capture of the Conclave judiciary, the manipulation of the Independent Boundary Commission, and the systematic exclusion of human diplomatic participation through procedural mechanisms designed to ensure that the species most affected by this resolution had no meaningful ability to contest it. I estimate another 2 to 3 hours. The look on Torvund's face was something Vane would remember for the rest of her life. Not anger, not frustration, fear. The slow, cold recognition that the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Councilor, he said, and his voice had dropped to something almost private, as if the microphones weren't carrying every syllable to 11 billion listeners. You understand what you are doing. I understand exactly what I am doing, Chancellor. You understand the consequences. I have understood the consequences since I began preparing these remarks. I accepted them before I walked onto this platform. She let that land, then she continued. 3 hours in. Vane's throat was raw. The graze wound on her neck had stopped bleeding but throbbed with a dull, persistent heat. Her legs ached from standing on the platform section 40 Fortwelve, written for a species that sat during formal address, had no provision for seating during extended remarks, and Vane had not asked for accommodation. She would stand until she was finished or until she collapsed. The chamber had settled into a strange, tense rhythm. Delegates who had been shouting 2 hours ago were now silent, watching, reading the documents on their terminals as Vane walked them through the evidence. Some had their heads in their hands. A few were weeping delegates from smaller species whose colonial territories had been quietly traded away in deals they were only now seeing documented. The vote count had shifted dramatically. Of the 312 committed yes votes, 47 had formally switched to no. 19 more had changed to abstain. The resolution still had enough votes to pass, but the margin was shrinking. And something else was happening. Something Vane had not planned for, but Kira Vasquez apparently had. During the first hour of Vane's address, while the chamber was focused on the revelations pouring from the speaker's platform, the human diplomatic team had quietly begun transmitting the verified documents to every independent news service, academic institution, and civil rights organization in Conclave space. Not through official channels, those were controlled by the same power blocks Vane was exposing. Through back channels, encrypted relays, personal contacts that Vasquez had spent 6 years cultivating. By the second hour, the documents were everywhere. Independent analysts were confirming the financial records. Journalists were publishing. The smaller species home networks, the ones that usually carried only local news and entertainment, were running the story wall-to-wall. By the third hour, the Conclave Assembly's public broadcast feed, which normally drew between 2 and 4 million concurrent viewers, was at 237 million, and climbing. The chamber didn't know that yet. Vane didn't know it. But Kira Vasquez did, because her tactical team was feeding her updates through a subdermal comm implant that looked, to anyone watching, like nothing at all. Vasquez's thumb stopped tapping. She uncrossed her arms, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself the faintest trace of a smile. It was the smile of someone who had spent 6 years being told she had no voice in this room, and who had spent every one of those voiceless hours building an architecture of consequence so thorough that when the moment came, she would not need to speak at all. Someone else would speak for her, someone inside the system. Someone whose words would carry a weight that no human voice could, because Vane Soria was not a human complaining about mistreatment. She was a Valori Councilor, a 29-year veteran, a member of the Chancellor's own species bloc, standing on that platform and saying, "I was one of you. I believed what you believe. And I am telling you that everything we built here is rotten." That was the weapon Vasquez had been waiting 6 years to deploy. Not a fleet, not a threat, not a sanctions package or an economic retaliation. A conscience. One alien conscience, armed with 417 pages of truth, standing in a room full of 400 compromised delegates and refusing to sit down. The smaller delegations were beginning to realize it. You could see it in the way the Morvan delegates were talking to each other, not the panicked whispers of the first hour, but something slower, more deliberate. They were comparing notes, cross-referencing their own records against the documents Vane was presenting, finding matches, finding losses they had attributed to bad luck or poor advocacy that were now revealed as deliberate. The Ulexi Collective had stopped talking altogether. Their senior delegate had pulled up a comprehensive list of every conclave decision affecting Ulexi interests over the past decade, and was scrolling through it with the expression of someone reading their own autopsy report. At the 3-hour-15 mark, Chancellor Torvan played his final card. "This body will take a mandatory security recess," he announced, slamming the gavel with an authority he no longer fully possessed. "The chamber will be cleared and swept. Session will resume in 90 minutes. It was a naked power move. A 90-minute recess would break Vane's momentum, give the Drelith Cathari block time to regroup, and allow Torvan's team to find a procedural basis for terminating her speaking allocation when the session resumed. Vane had anticipated this. She had prepared for it the way she had prepared for everything, by reading the procedural code until she could recite it from memory. Point of order, Chancellor. The recess has been called. Section 40 paragraph 9. No recess shall interrupt an address delivered under this section unless the speaking delegate consents to the interruption or is physically incapacitated. I do not consent. Torvund's gavel hand froze mid-swing. You cannot compel me to yield the floor, Chancellor, and you cannot recess the chamber while I hold it. That is not my interpretation, that is the text. For a long moment, Torvund said nothing. The chamber held its breath. 400 delegates, 11 billion viewers, and one human ambassador in the gallery, all watching the most powerful official in Conclave space, realized that the system he had spent 30 years bending to his advantage had just been turned against him by a woman with a bleeding neck and a 400-page document. He set the gavel down. Continue, Councilor. Vane continued. She moved into the judicial section of the ledger. Cases where the Conclave judiciary had ruled against smaller species in territorial disputes, rulings that consistently benefited Dralith and Cathari interests. She showed the financial connections between the judges and the parties who benefited from their rulings. She named judicial appointments that had been traded for resource concessions. The most devastating case was the Selden border ruling of 3 years prior. The Selden Compact had filed a claim to a resource-rich asteroid belt in their own home system, a claim that predated the Conclave by centuries. The Dralith had filed a competing claim based on a survey license that was, as Vane now demonstrated, backdated by 9 months. The judiciary had ruled in favor of the Dralith. The presiding judge, Justice Orel Khan, had received a residential property on Velen Prime valued at 12 million credits 6 weeks after the ruling. The property was registered under his mate's name. Justice Khan, Vane said, displaying the property transfer documents, is also the judge assigned to the preliminary review of Resolution 1187 Omega's constitutional validity. The review concluded in 48 hours, a process that has historically taken no less than 30 days. Justice Khan found no constitutional impediments. She looked at the Selden section. Delegate Thren Makari was sitting perfectly still, but her four-fingered hands were pressed flat against the table surface in front of her, as if anchoring herself to something solid. Her species had a translucent quality to their skin, and the blood vessels beneath were pulsing visibly. The Selden Compact lost a resource claim worth an estimated 40 billion credits, Vane said. That loss contributed to a 12% economic contraction in Selden space, which in turn reduced their trade capacity, which in turn reduced their diplomatic influence in this body, which in turn made it easier for the Dralith to pressure them into supporting Resolution 1187 Omega. She paused. The circle is complete. She moved on before the Selden delegation could respond. There were 12 more cases to present. Then she addressed the human question directly. For 6 years, she said, this body has treated the human delegation as a security concern rather than a diplomatic partner. We granted them observer status, the lowest tier of participation this institution offers. We excluded them from committee hearings. We denied them speaking rights. We subjected their communications to monitoring that we do not apply to any other delegation. We did this not because they posed a genuine security threat, but because their presence was inconvenient to the interests that control this body's agenda. She looked at the gallery, at Kira Vasquez, sitting in her single allocated seat with the same unreadable expression she had worn for 6 years. Ambassador Vasquez, Vane said, has sat in that seat through 411 sessions. She has been insulted to her face by delegates who knew she had no procedural right to respond. She has watched this body pass 17 resolutions restricting human trade, movement, and diplomatic access, all while humanity was denied the right to speak in its own defense. She has endured this with a composure that should embarrass every one of us. Vane's voice did not waver, but something in it deepened. I have served this institution for 29 years. I believed in it. I believed that the Conclave, for all its flaws, represented the best mechanism our civilizations had developed for resolving disputes without violence. I believed that the procedural framework, the codes, the rules, the traditions existed to protect the weak from the strong. She paused. I was wrong. The framework exists to give the strong a civilized vocabulary for doing whatever they intended to do anyway. Resolution 1187 Omega is not justice. It is not security. It is not even politics. It is a mugging conducted in formal robes, and I will not be a party to it. The chamber was absolutely silent. I formally withdraw my vote in favor of Resolution 1187 Omega, Vane said. I change my registration to no, and I call on every delegate in this chamber who has read the evidence I have presented, who has seen the corruption, the manipulation, the engineered provocation to do the same. She did not raise her voice. She did not pound the lectern. She stood on the platform with blue blood drying on her neck and 4 hours of testimony behind her, and delivered the line the way you deliver a fact that no longer requires emphasis. The evidence had done the work. The words were just the signature at the bottom of the page. The lead Dralith delegate, Ambassador Crean, a tall, thick-bodied reptilian whose scales had gone from dark green to ashen gray over the course of the afternoon, rose to his feet. His voice was hoarse, whether from rage or from the dawning understanding that his delegation's entire political architecture was collapsing in real time. Vane could not tell. The Dralith delegation categorically rejects these allegations, he said. The documents presented are verified, Vane said, by your own Conclave's independent verification office, which I remind you was established by Dralith Initiative 30 years ago specifically to serve as the authoritative standard for evidentiary authentication. You built the verification system, Ambassador Crean. It is now verifying your corruption. Crean's mouth closed. He stood there for a moment, a large reptilian figure in ceremonial robes that suddenly looked like a costume, and then he sat back down. He did not speak again for the remainder of the session. What followed was the longest 20 minutes in conclave history. Delegations huddled. Encrypted messages flew between sections. Legal aides ran calculations on vote counts. The public broadcast feed hit 340 million concurrent viewers. And one by one the votes flipped. The Selvan Compact had already switched. Now the Morvan Federation followed, then the Ulexi Collective. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the chamber, the Velori Independent Caucus, Torvan's own species bloc, 31 delegates who had been loyal to the Chancellor for decades, issued a joint statement withdrawing their support for the resolution. Their statement was one sentence. The evidence presented by Councilor Soria requires a full institutional audit before any major resolution can proceed with legitimacy. Torvan read it on his display. His face went gray. The math had inverted. The resolution no longer had the votes to pass. But Torvan was not finished. He had one more weapon, and Vane knew he would use it. This body, he announced, his voice strained but controlled, will table Resolution 1187 Omega pending investigation. However, I must address the conduct of Councilor Soria. The evidence she has presented, regardless of its content, was obtained through unauthorized access to classified diplomatic communications. This constitutes a violation of Conclave Security Statute 77, which carries mandatory penalties including removal from office and potential criminal prosecution. He looked at Vane. There was no pretense of neutrality in his eyes now. Councilor Soria, I am instructing the Conclave Security Directorate to place you under formal investigation. Your diplomatic immunity is suspended effective immediately. You will surrender your credentials and submit to detention pending. Chancellor. Kira Vasquez's voice cut across the chamber like a blade. Every head turned toward the gallery. Vasquez was standing. She had not been given permission to speak. She did not have speaking rights. She was an observer with no procedural standing whatsoever. She spoke anyway. Her voice carried the particular quality that the chamber had learned to associate with human diplomats: not loud, not aggressive, but textured with an absolute certainty that made you check your own footing. If Councilor Soria is detained, Vasquez said, the evidence she has presented, all 417 pages, will be transmitted to every independent judiciary, investigative body, and news organization outside Conclave jurisdiction within 60 seconds. We have the distribution network in place. It is already loaded. The only thing preventing transmission is a dead man's switch that Councilor Soria is currently holding active. Vane's hand resting on the lectern shifted slightly. A small device, no larger than a stylus, was visible between her fingers. A single green light pulsed on its surface. If her hand leaves that device, if she is detained, removed, or incapacitated, the switch opens and the transmission fires. Every classified document she has presented today goes to every jurisdiction the Conclave does not control. And I should mention, Chancellor, that the documents include your personal financial records. All of them. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a man realizing that the trap had been built around him layer by layer, over months, and he had walked into it believing he was the one in control. Torvald's mouth opened, closed, opened again. You have no standing to address this chamber, he said. It was the only thing he had left. You're right, Vasquez said. I don't, but Councilor Soria does, and she's not finished. Vasquez sat down, crossed her arms, the faintest trace of that smile again. The chamber processed what had just happened. An observer with no speaking rights had just threatened the Chancellor of the Conclave Assembly on a live broadcast viewed by hundreds of millions. She had done it in 3 sentences. She had done it without raising her voice. And the threat was credible because every piece of evidence Vane had presented for the past 3 hours was already verified, already public, and already spreading through channels the Conclave could not control. Torvald's legal aides were whispering to him again. One of them was shaking her head. Another was scrolling through what appeared to be a damage assessment, a real-time analysis of how many independent jurisdictions had already received copies of the ledger, and what the legal implications would be if the full, unredacted version was released. The answer, apparently, was very bad. Torvald's face told the story without words. He turned to the chamber. For a moment he looked like he might speak, might attempt one more procedural maneuver, one more invocation of authority. But the authority was gone. The ceremonial robes were just fabric, the gavel was just metal, the title was just a word. He gestured toward the platform, a small defeated wave of his hand. Continue. Vane Soria spoke for another 47 minutes. She presented the final section of the ledger, the personal financial records of Chancellor Torvald, showing a pattern of payments from Drelith and Cathari sources that stretched back 9 years. She presented the records of his family's business holdings, which had expanded by 400% during his tenure as Chancellor, all through contracts awarded by entities whose Conclave applications he had personally approved. She showed the property portfolio. 11 residences across 7 star systems, each registered under a different family member's name, each purchased within 60 days of a major Conclave ruling that benefited Drelith or Cathari interests. She showed the education trust Chancellor Torvald's 3 children, all enrolled in the Cathari hegemony's most prestigious academy, tuition waived by special arrangement, an arrangement that coincided precisely with Torvald's appointment to the chancellorship. She showed the communication logs, private messages between Torvald and the Dralith Commerce Director, discussing the timing of Resolution 1187 Omega. One message, sent 9 days before the resolution was formally introduced, read, "The human problem requires a permanent solution. We have the votes. We need the procedural cover. Your office will provide it." Torvald's reply, sent 40 minutes later, "Understood, timeline as discussed. The committee will fast-track." The holographic projection hung above the chamber floor like a verdict. 400 delegates stared at it. 11 billion broadcast viewers stared at it. Chancellor Torvald, sitting on the dais with his ceremonial chain of office weighing on his shoulders like an anchor, stared at it. He did not object. He did not challenge the authenticity. He sat in his chair and said nothing, and his silence was the loudest thing in the room. She presented it all with the same clinical precision she had maintained for 4 hours and 22 minutes. No anger, no triumph. Just the facts, one after another, each one a nail in a coffin that Torvald had built for himself. When she finished, the chamber was a different place. 61 additional delegations had switched their votes during her final remarks. Resolution 1187 Omega was dead. Not tabled, dead. A formal motion to withdraw the resolution had been filed by the Dralith delegation itself, which had apparently decided that cutting its losses was preferable to having the remaining documents read into the public record. But that was not the end. Delegate Thren Makari of the Selvan Compact, the first to switch her vote, hours ago stood and made a motion that no one in the chamber had expected. "I move," she said, "for an immediate vote of no confidence in Chancellor Torvald." The motion required a simple majority. It passed in 3 minutes with 287 votes in favor. Torvald removed his ceremonial chain of office. He held it for a moment, a heavy thing, wrought in silver-white alloy, each link engraved with the name of a chancellor who had preceded him. 3 centuries of names. He set it on the dais with a sound that echoed across the empty chamber like the closing of a book. He did not look at Vane. He did not look at Vasquez. He walked down the steps from the dais, across the marble floor, and out through the side entrance. The door sealed behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss. He would be arrested by Conclave security before he reached his residence. The charges would include corruption, abuse of office, conspiracy to pervert the course of Conclave proceedings, and once the Prahl-Vest connection was fully investigated, accessory to attempted murder. His trial would last 8 months. He would be convicted on all counts. But that was later. In the moment, the only thing that mattered was the sound of the door closing behind him and the silence that followed. Vane Soria stood on the platform for a long time after the chamber began to empty. The holographic displays dimmed. The recording drones powered down one by one. Daylight still poured through the glass dome, warming the marble floor, catching the dust motes that drifted in the still air. She was exhausted. Her legs trembled. The wound on her neck had reopened during the last hour, and a thin line of pale blue blood traced its way down her collarbone. The dead man's switch was still in her hand. Her fingers had locked around it so tightly during the final confrontation with Torvald that she was having difficulty unclenching them. She became aware that someone was standing at the base of the platform. Kira Vasquez. The human ambassador had left her gallery seat and crossed the chamber floor, walking through the space where 400 delegates had sat and listened and reckoned with the wreckage of their institution. Vasquez looked up at her. The unreadable expression was gone. What was beneath it was something Vane had not expected: grief. "You know what happens now," Vasquez said. Vane nodded. She knew. The Conclave Security Directorate would investigate her for obtaining classified documents. The investigation would be slow, politicized, and ultimately irrelevant. The documents were already public, and no prosecution could unring that bell, but it would consume years of her life. Her career was over. Her reputation within Valori political circles was destroyed. The power blocks she had exposed would not forgive, and the institutional apparatus she had dismantled would reassemble around a new center of gravity that would remember her as a traitor. She would spend the rest of her life in various forms of exile, legal proceedings, political isolation. The quiet social death that comes to anyone who breaks the unwritten rules of power. She had known all of this before she stepped onto the platform. She had known it when she sent the encrypted message to Vasquez 3 days ago. She had known it for 4 years, since the day she began compiling the ledger, and understood with absolute clarity that the information she was gathering would eventually demand a choice between her career and her conscience. "I know what happens," Vane said. "I chose this." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up and offered her hand. Vane looked at it. In the Conclave, physical contact between species was rare and formal. In human culture, Vane knew, the offered hand meant something specific: recognition, solidarity. The acknowledgement that what had been done could not be undone, that the cost was real, and that the person who paid it was not alone. She took the hand. "The documents you gave me," Vane said. "The internal communications, the financial records. How long did it take your people to obtain them?" "Some of them years, some of them weeks. We've been building the intelligence architecture since I took this posting." "You knew this day would come." "We knew a day like this would come. We didn't know who would stand up. We prepared the ammunition and waited for someone inside the system to be willing to fire it." "And if no one had?" Vasquez's expression shifted, something harder beneath the grief. "Then we would have found another way. We always do." Vane released her hand. She looked up at the glass dome, at the daylight pouring through it, at the distant shapes of patrol cruisers drifting across a sky that looked exactly the same as it had 4 hours ago, when a plasma bolt had missed her skull by 3 centimeters and everything had begun. "The resolution is dead," Vane said, "but the system that produced it is still standing. This was one vote, one chancellor. The interests behind them are untouched." "I know," Vasquez said. "That's why I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer." Vane looked at her. "Earth is building its own diplomatic framework, independent of the Conclave. We've been doing it quietly for 3 years: trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, cultural exchange programs with the smaller species that the Conclave has been marginalizing. The Selvan, the Morvan, the Ulexi, 11 species so far with more interested. A parallel institution. A better one, or at least one that starts with the right foundations instead of spending 3 centuries pretending the rot isn't there." Vasquez paused. "We need people who understand institutional architecture, people who know what works and what doesn't, people who have seen the failure modes from the inside." "You're offering me a position." "I'm offering you a purpose. The position is whatever you want it to be." Vasquez paused. "And I'm offering you something the Conclave never will again. Colleagues who understand what it costs to do the right thing in a room full of people who would rather you sat down." Vane was silent for a long time. The chamber was empty now. The last of the cleaning drones hummed along the far wall, collecting debris from the assassin's plasma bolt. The marble lectern would need to be replaced. She thought about 29 years of service, about the committee hearings and the procedural votes, and the careful, patient, dutiful work of maintaining an institution she had believed in. About the moment, 4 years ago, reading a financial transfer record that should not have existed when belief had cracked and understanding had flooded in, cold and clear and irreversible. She thought about the ledger, 417 pages, every page a piece of her faith, recorded and cataloged and weaponized. She thought about the look on Torvund's face when the vote of no confidence passed. She thought about the dead man's switch in her hand, and the 4 hours she had stood on this platform, and the plasma bolt that had missed her skull by 3 centimeters because somewhere in the corrupt machinery of the Conclave, a functionary had been given the instruction neutralize, and had interpreted it literally. Yes, Vane said. The word came out quiet, but it filled the empty chamber the way a stone fills still water, a single disturbance spreading outward until it touches every edge. Vasquez nodded, no surprise, no celebration. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a decision that had been inevitable since the moment Vane walked onto the platform. There's a transport waiting at Docking Bay 7, Vasquez said. Human vessel. It's been there since yesterday in case the vote went wrong. You plan for that too. We plan for everything. It's a species trait. Vane looked at the chamber one last time. The tiered seats where she had sat for 29 years. The dais where Torvon had presided. The gallery seat where Kira Vasquez had spent 6 years in silence, watching, learning, waiting. The glass dome above, letting the light in. She stepped down from the platform. The wound on her neck stung as she moved, and her legs were unsteady after 4 hours of standing, and the device in her hand was still pulsing its small green light. She walked with Vasquez toward the chamber doors, 2 figures in step, crossing the empty floor of a place that had tried to silence both of them and failed. Their footsteps echoed off the marble, the only sound in a room that had held the voices of 400 delegates and the weight of 11 billion watching. As they reached the doors, Vane paused. She turned back one last time. The chamber was beautiful. She had always thought so. The glass dome, the curved tiers, the polished stone, the holographic displays, it was designed to embody the idea that governance could be elevated, that the act of deliberation could be made noble through architecture. And for 29 years, she had believed the architecture told the truth. Now she knew it had been a stage set. Exquisite, yes. Convincing, certainly. But a set. And the play performed on it had been written by people who understood that the audience would never check the script against reality as long as the scenery was beautiful enough. She turned back to the doors. Behind them, the holographic displays flickered once and went dark. Ahead of them the doors were open, and daylight was pouring through. 16 hours later, as Vane Sorya's transport cleared the outer boundary of Conclave space, 2 things happened simultaneously. First, the Conclave Assembly convened an emergency session to elect an interim chancellor. The session lasted 9 hours and ended without a selection. The 3 leading candidates were all named in the ledger. A 4th candidate, Delegate Thren Makari, was nominated from the floor by a coalition of smaller species blocks. She won on the 2nd ballot. Her first official act was to grant full diplomatic status to the human delegation, speaking rights, voting rights, committee access, everything the Conclave had denied them for 6 years. Her second official act was to order a full institutional audit, beginning with every ruling, allocation, and appointment that appeared in the ledger. The audit would take 2 years and result in the removal of 43 officials, the reversal of 19 judicial rulings, and the restitution of an estimated 200 billion credits to species whose funds had been diverted. The Selvan Compact would recover its asteroid belt claim. The Ulexi refugees would get their housing. Her third official act was to formally commend Councilor Vane Sorya for service to the Conclave. The commendation passed unanimously. Even the Dralith delegates who remained in the chamber voted yes. None of them made eye contact while doing so. Second, Kira Vasquez transmitted a formal communication to every species government in Conclave space. It was brief. Humanity thanks Councilor Vane Sorya for her service to the principles this institution was built to protect. We note that those principles were defended today not by the institution itself, but by one individual who chose conscience over career, truth over safety, and sacrifice over silence. We remember. We do not forget who stood. The communication was received by 11 billion viewers across 400 star systems. Vane Soria read it on her transport's display, alone in the observation lounge, watching the stars slide past. She read it twice. She set the display down. She looked at her hands. The dead man's switch was on the table beside her, its green light finally dark. Her fingers still ached from holding it for 4 hours. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 4 years, Vane Soria did not think about the ledger. She did not think about the conclave, or the resolution, or the chancellor who had tried to recess the chamber to break her. She did not think about the plasma bolt, or the functionary who had fired it, or the instruction that had put a weapon in his hand. She thought about the doors of the chamber, open and full of light, and the human who had walked beside her through them. Outside the observation lounge window, the stars burned steady and uncountable, and the transport carried her forward into whatever came next. What came next was a small room on a human station called Threshold. The station orbited a brown dwarf in unclaimed space, a deliberate choice. No conclave jurisdiction, no Draelith patrol routes, no Cathari trade corridors, just a cold, dim star and a station that had been constructed in modular sections over the past 3 years, each section delivered by a different species cargo hauler, each delivery logged as routine commercial freight. Vane arrived on the 4th day after her testimony. The transport had made 2 intermediate stops to avoid tracking standard human counter-surveillance protocol, Vasquez had explained, with the casual tone of someone describing a commute. Vane had spent those 4 days sleeping more than she had in years, eating food from the human galley that was aggressively seasoned by Valori standards, and reading the hundreds of messages that had flooded her personal communication channel since the broadcast. Most were from people she had never met, delegate staffers, junior analysts, colonial administrators on planets she had mentioned in her testimony. The Ulexi delegate whose refugees were still in emergency shelters had sent a single line, "We saw, we will not forget." A Selden academic had sent a 40-page analysis of the judicial corruption section of the ledger, with additional evidence from Selden records that corroborated Vane's findings and extended them into areas she had not reached. 3 former Conclave employees, people who had been quietly fired or reassigned over the past decade, had sent their own documentation of irregularities they had witnessed and never reported. The silence she had expected had not come. What came instead was a flood, and the flood told her something she had not fully appreciated until she saw the scale of it. She had not been the only one who knew. She had simply been the first one willing to stand up and say it out loud. Threshold Station was not impressive. Vane had spent 29 years in conclave facilities, soaring architecture, polished stone, glass domes engineered to inspire awe. Threshold was functional. Gray corridors, exposed conduit runs along the ceiling. Lighting that was slightly too bright for Valori eyes and slightly too dim for everyone else, which meant the humans had tried to find a compromise and landed, as humans often did, on a solution that fully satisfied no one but was workable for all. The conference room where the first meeting took place had 12 chairs around a rectangular table, no holographic projections, no ceremonial robes, no tiered seating designed to remind you of your place in the hierarchy, just a table and chairs, and when Vane walked in, every person in the room stood. Not as a formality, not as protocol. They stood because they wanted to, and the difference was immediately apparent. Kira Vasquez was at the head of the table. Beside her sat a human Vane had not met, a tall man with close-cropped gray hair, and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in uniform before transitioning to diplomacy. Vasquez introduced him as Admiral James Okonkwo, retired, now serving as the framework security architect. Admiral Okonkwo designed the intelligence operation that produced the data we shared with you, Vasquez said. 6 years of signals collection, financial forensics, and communications intercepts. Okonkwo nodded at Vane. His eyes were steady and measuring, not hostile, but not warm either. The eyes of someone who assessed everyone he met for operational reliability before extending anything resembling trust. "Your testimony was effective," he said. "That was all." From a man like Okonkwo, Vane understood, it was a significant statement. The other 10 chairs held representatives from the species Vasquez had mentioned the parallel framework's founding members. Vane recognized most of them. The Selvan delegate was not Thren Makari, who had remained at the Conclave as interim chancellor, but a younger diplomat named Rael Tessin, sharp-featured and precise in her speech. The Morvan representative was a heavy-set, slow-speaking male named Doreth Kelun, who had served 3 decades on the Morvan Federation's Trade Council. The Ulexi had sent their colony governor, a diminutive female named Iveth San, whose quiet voice carried the particular gravity of someone who had spent years managing a crisis with inadequate resources and no outside help. There were others, species that the Conclave had classified as minor species that had been given just enough representation to maintain the fiction of inclusivity, while their interests were systematically subordinated to the Drelith Cathari bloc. None of them were minor. Every person at this table had been selected for competence, not for political connection, and the combination of skill and grievance produced something far more dangerous than anger: clarity. Vasquez opened the meeting with no preamble. "We are not building a replacement for the Conclave," she said. "We are building a framework that makes the Conclave's failure mode structurally impossible." Councilor Soria's testimony demonstrated what happens when institutional oversight is concentrated in the hands of the parties being overseen. Our framework distributes that oversight across independent nodes with no single point of capture. She activated a simple display, not holographic, just a flat screen mounted on the wall showing a network diagram. 12 nodes, interconnected with no central hub. "No chancellor," Vasquez said. "No single presiding authority. Decisions require distributed consensus. Financial oversight is handled by rotating audit committees with mandatory species rotation. Judicial appointments are randomized from a qualified pool, with automatic recusal protocols for any case involving a species represented on the appointing body." Vane studied the diagram. The institutional architecture was elegant in its paranoia. Every mechanism that the Conclave had been corrupted through centralized authority, permanent committee assignments, unaudited discretionary funds, judicial capture had been addressed with a structural countermeasure. "Who designed this?" Vane asked. "I did," Vasquez said. "Over the past 4 years, using your ledger as a diagnostic manual, every corruption pathway you documented became a design constraint. If the old system failed because of X, the new system makes X structurally impossible." Vane looked at her. "You had the ledger for 3 days. I had the broad strokes for 4 years. Your encrypted message 3 days ago gave me the details, but the architecture was already in draft. The details refined it. You built a new institution based on the failure modes of the old one, before you had confirmation that the old one would fail. I built it based on the certainty that it would. Institutions built on concentrated power always fail the same way. The only question was timing." Vane sat with that for a moment, the clinical certainty of it. The human capacity for planning that others experienced as something between admiration and unease. The way they could look at a system and see, not what it was, but what it would inevitably become, and then start building the replacement before the original had finished collapsing. It was unsettling. It was also, Vane admitted to herself, exactly what the situation required. Rael Tessin spoke next. The Selvan diplomat's voice was precise, each word placed with the care of someone who had grown up in a culture where imprecise language had consequences. The Selvin Compact is prepared to commit fully to this framework. Our asteroid belt claim is being restored through the Conclave audit, but we have no confidence that the restored claim will survive the next political cycle. Chancellor Macari is genuine, but she is one person in a system designed to absorb and neutralize reformers. We give the current reforms 18 months before institutional reversion begins. Doroth Kelun, the Morvan representative, rumbled his agreement. The Morvan Federation concurs. Interim Chancellor Macari is an honest actor, but honest actors in corrupt systems are temporary. We need a permanent alternative. One by one, the other delegates voiced similar assessments. The conclave's reforms would be real but shallow. The audit would produce results, but the underlying power dynamics, the Dralith and Kethari resource monopolies, the concentration of military capacity, the structural advantages embedded in 3 centuries of institutional design would reassert themselves within a few years. The conclave would not collapse, it would heal. And when it healed, it would remember what Vane had done, and it would build immunity against anyone who tried to do it again. Which was exactly why the parallel framework needed to be operational before that healing was complete. Vane listened to all of it. She said very little during that first meeting. She was processing not just the information, but the experience of sitting in a room where 12 representatives of 12 species were speaking honestly about their vulnerabilities, their fears, and their strategic calculations without the protective armor of diplomatic euphemism. In the conclave, no one said what they meant. Language was a tool for concealment. You said further review when you meant denial. You said security concerns when you meant political inconvenience. You said procedural requirements when you meant obstruction. Vane had spent 29 years fluent in that language, and hearing people speak without it was like stepping from a dark room into daylight. Disorienting, painful, necessary. At the end of the meeting, Vasquez turned to her. Councilor Soria, you have more institutional experience than anyone at this table. You know how governance structures fail because you watched one fail from the inside for 4 years. We need that knowledge. Not your political connections, those are gone. Not your institutional authority, that's been revoked. Your understanding. The map in your head of every place where a system can rot. Vane looked at the display on the wall. The 12-node network. The structural countermeasures. The architecture of a thing that did not yet exist, but was being built with the methodical precision of people who had studied exactly how the last version broke. There are gaps in your design, she said. Vasquez leaned forward. Show me. Vane spent the next 6 weeks on Threshold Station, working 18-hour days with Vasquez's team. She found 14 structural vulnerabilities in the framework's design, places where the distributed consensus model could be gamed, where the rotating audit committees could be stalled through coordinated non-participation, where the randomized judicial appointments could be manipulated by controlling the composition of the qualified pool. For each vulnerability, she designed a countermeasure. For each countermeasure, a Conclave's security team ran adversarial simulations, red teaming the fix to see if it could be broken by a sufficiently motivated actor with the resources of a major power block. 3 of the countermeasures failed the simulation. Vane redesigned them. They were tested again. 2 held. The 3rd required a fundamental restructuring of the judicial appointment process that took 9 days of continuous work and produced a mechanism so Byzantine in its safeguards that Okonkwo called it elegant paranoia and meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. The work was exhausting and clarifying. For the first time in years, Vane was building instead of documenting decay. Every structural safeguard she designed was informed by a specific failure she had witnessed, a specific committee that had been captured, a specific judge that had been purchased, a specific fund that had been diverted. The ledger, which had been a record of destruction, became a blueprint for prevention. She discovered something she had not expected. She was good at this. Not just competent, genuinely good. 29 years of watching institutional machinery had given her an intuition for load-bearing structures that the younger delegates lacked. She could look at a governance proposal and see, almost immediately, where the stress points were, where a determined actor would apply pressure, where the system would bend, and where it would break. Vasquez noticed. She did not comment on it directly, that was not her style. But Vane observed that the human ambassador began routing increasingly complex design questions through her, and that the other delegates began deferring to her judgment on structural matters with a respect that was earned rather than assigned. During the third week, a message arrived from the Conclave. It was an official communication from the Security Directorate, addressed to former Councilor Vane Soria, informing her that formal charges had been filed under Conclave Security Statute 77 for unauthorized access to classified diplomatic communications. The charges carried a maximum penalty of 15 years detention. Her assets within Conclave jurisdiction had been frozen. Her diplomatic credentials had been permanently revoked. She was ordered to surrender herself to the nearest Conclave security post within 30 standard days. Vane read the communication in her quarters. She read it once carefully, noting the legal language, the charge specifications, the penalty ranges. She set the display down. She sat for a moment in the gray, functional room that had become her home, looking at the exposed conduit on the ceiling and the too bright human lighting. Then she went back to work. When Vasquez asked her about it later that day casually, over a working dinner of human food that was, as always, aggressively seasoned, Vane summarized the charges in 2 sentences. 15 years detention, 30 days to surrender. Vasquez ate a forkful of something she called pasta, and nothing. They cannot enforce it outside Conclave jurisdiction. The charges exist to discourage others from doing what I did. They are a message, not a threat. Does the message bother you? Vane considered the question honestly. It confirms that the system is functioning as I described. Institutions protect themselves. The Conclave cannot undo the ledger, so it punishes the person who delivered it. This is the predicted response. If anything, the speed of the charges suggests that the reforms are causing more disruption than I expected, which is encouraging. Vasquez looked at her for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, not quite warmth, but a recognition. The recognition of someone who understood costs because she had paid them, and who had decided that the payment was worth the purchase. "You're handling this better than most people would," Vasquez said. "I had 4 years to prepare for this outcome. The preparation helps." "It usually does." They ate in silence for a while. The station hummed around them, life support, power systems, the subtle vibration of a structure holding atmosphere against vacuum. 12 species representatives working in adjacent rooms, building something that might fail, that probably would face challenges its designers could not yet imagine, but that was being constructed with the deliberate intention of not repeating the mistakes that had corrupted the last attempt. It was not hope, exactly. Vane was too experienced for hope. It was something more durable. It was the decision to build anyway, knowing that all systems eventually fail, knowing that corruption is not a deviation but a tendency, knowing that every safeguard she designed would one day be tested by someone clever enough and motivated enough to find its weakness. Building anyway. That was the thing she had learned from the humans. Not their aggression, not their resourcefulness, not their unsettling talent for long-term strategic planning. Their stubborn, irrational, entirely unjustifiable insistence on building things they knew would eventually break, and then building them anyway, and then fixing them when they broke, and then building again. It was, she thought, possibly the most important thing she had ever learned from anyone. 9 months after the testimony, The framework it still did not have an official name, which the Ulexi delegate Iveth San called either admirably practical or deeply concerning, held its first formal session. 14 species attended. The original 11, plus 3 more that had joined in the intervening months, the Drevani Collective, the Palani Union, and in a development that sent shockwaves through the Conclave, the Velori Independent Caucus, the same 31 delegates who had broken with Chancellor Torvon during Vane's testimony. They did not leave the Conclave. They maintained dual participation, attending Conclave sessions while simultaneously engaging with the framework. It was a political position that infuriated the Conclave's remaining power blocks and delighted the smaller species, because it demonstrated that the framework was not a rebellion but an alternative, a proof of concept, a quiet, structural argument that governance could be done differently. The first session was held in Threshold Station's largest compartment, a cargo bay that had been converted into a meeting space with the same functional, unbeautiful practicality that characterized everything on the station. Chairs in a circle, no tiers, no platform, no dais. Vane sat in that circle and looked around at the faces. Rael Tessen's sharp Selvan features, Doreth Kellun's broad Morvan frame, Iveth San's small Ulexi form, nearly lost in a chair designed for larger species, Admiral Okonkwo's measuring gaze, Vasquez's composed expression, the same one she had worn in that gallery seat for 6 years, except that now there was no gallery, no seat, and no silence. Now she was at the table. And Vane was there too, not as a Conclave councilor, not as a Velori representative. As someone who had seen the inside of a failing system and chosen to help build a better one. Someone whose expertise was not in power but in the anatomy of its corruption, and who could use that knowledge the way an immunologist uses a virus to teach the new body how to resist what had killed the old one. The session opened with no ceremony. Vasquez spoke first. "Welcome to the first formal session of this framework. We still don't have a name. Suggestions are welcome. In the meantime, we have work to do." Vane almost smiled, almost. She looked at the circle of chairs, at the exposed conduit on the ceiling, at the cargo bay walls that had no marble, no glass dome, no architecture designed to make governance look noble. This room made no promises about what it was. It was a room. Functional, honest. A place where people sat in a circle and said what they meant, and the walls did not pretend to be anything other than walls. It was not beautiful, but it was real. And for the first time since she had stood on that platform with blood on her neck and 400 pages of truth in her hands, Vane Soria felt something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. Not hope, something sturdier. Purpose. The session began. Outside the station, the brown dwarf burned cold and steady, and the stars stretched in every direction, and in the space between them, something new was being built by people who knew exactly how the old thing had broken and were determined stubbornly, irrationally, humanly determined to do better. The work continued. It always does.